I stood at the glass wall and said, "This place didn't exist 5 years ago." Daniel smiled beside me and said, "You built it, Ethan." I laughed and replied, "No, we built it." That word mattered to me. Family mattered. I told the team, "I don't believe in bosses. I believe in people." Liam nodded fast. Olivia clapped softly. I felt proud watching them. I said, "Loyalty is the only currency that never crashes." Daniel added, "And you've always paid us well." I trusted him. I trusted him more than myself. After the meeting, Daniel walked with me. He said, "You good with the expansion plan?" I said, "If you're good, I'm good." He hesitated, then said, "We're solid." I didn't notice his eyes sliding away. I didn't notice Liam whispering behind us. Sophie caught me near my office. She asked, "Do you ever worry you give too much?" I smiled and said, "People don't bite the hand that feeds them." She frowned but said nothing. I took that as agreement. Later, I heard voices in the hallway. Liam said, "Just wait." Daniel replied, "Not yet." When they saw me, Daniel laughed and said, "We were talking about numbers." I joked back, "As long as they're good numbers." They laughed. I laughed too. I walked through the open floor and said, "Look at this place." Noah said, "It feels unreal." I said, "Hard work makes miracles boring." Everyone laughed again. That sound filled me with pride. In my office, Daniel leaned on the desk and said, "You trust us, right?" I answered without thinking, "With everything." He nodded slowly and said, "Then we won't let you down." I believed him. That night, I stayed late and looked at old photos on the wall. Empty room, folding chair, first paycheck. I whispered to myself, "This company runs on loyalty." I didn't know loyalty was already leaking out. I locked the door, confident, certain, blind, and smiling. Before leaving, Daniel called out, "Tomorrow's meeting is big." I said, "Big is good." He said, "Trust us." I replied, "I always do." Liam passed by and said, "We've got your back." I said, "I know." Olivia waved and said, "Good night, Ethan." I answered, "Rest well, everyone." In the elevator, I said to myself, "This is what success feels like." My phone buzzed. Daniel texted, "Proud of you." I typed back, "Proud of all of you." I stepped outside, breath deep, and thought, nothing can touch us. I didn't see the shadows forming behind my confidence. I smiled and said, "Tomorrow will be even better." The building lights shut down one by one. I felt untouchable. I felt certain. I felt right. That certainty wrapped around me like armor, heavy, shining, and false. I walked away believing loyalty was permanent, trust was unbreakable, and family never turned on its own. I was wrong, but that truth waited patiently, sharpening itself in the dark corners of my perfect company that I loved without fear yet. The meeting started like any other. I said, "Let's run through the numbers." Liam cleared his throat and said, "Revenue dipped, but it's temporary." I leaned forward and asked, "Temporary how?" He smiled and replied, "Market noise." Daniel didn't even look at the screen. He said, "I trust Liam." That should have slowed me down. I said, "These expenses weren't here last quarter." Liam tapped the table and said, "Reclassification." Daniel added, "It's clean, Ethan." I felt something twist in my chest. I asked, "Why wasn't I told?" Liam answered fast, "Didn't want to bother you?" Daniel nodded. "You hired us to handle this." Olivia sat quiet. I said, "Thoughts?" She avoided my eyes and said, "If Daniel agrees, I agree." That bothered me. She always spoke up. I told myself people have off days. I said, "All right." After the meeting, Daniel walked beside me. He said, "You okay?" I laughed and said, "I should be asking you that." He replied, "You worry too much." I wanted to believe him. Trust felt easier than doubt. Sophie caught me near the stairwell. She whispered, "Did those numbers make sense to you?" I said, "They did enough." She shook her head and said, "Something feels wrong." I sighed and replied, "You're reading shadows." She said, "Just be careful." I smiled and said, "I always am." I wasn't. Back in my office, I stared at the report. I told myself, they've earned my trust. Another voice said, or they're using it. I pushed that voice down. Loyalty meant believing before proving. That was my rule. Daniel knocked and said, "We need approval today." I asked, "Any risks?" He said, "Only if we delay." Liam emailed, "Time sensitive." Olivia sent nothing. That silence pressed on me. I asked myself, why do you hesitate? I answered, because you care. I didn't ask, about what? I picked up the pen and said, this moves us forward, right? Daniel said, always. I looked at the signature line. I remembered Sophie's eyes. I remembered Olivia's silence. I remembered my own words about loyalty. I signed. Daniel exhaled and said, good call. Liam messaged, thank you. I leaned back and told myself, trust builds strength. The unease stayed. I ignored it. I closed the folder and said, next problem. As they left, I heard Daniel say quietly, he didn't question it. Liam replied, he never does. I told myself I misheard. I always did when truth knocked softly. I sat alone and said, this is leadership. I didn't know I had just approved the knife meant for my back, sharpened by people who smiled while asking me to hold it steady. I stopped when I heard my name. Daniel's voice came from the conference room. He said, Ethan won't question it. Liam replied, he never does. Daniel's tone was flat, sharp, nothing like the man I trusted. I leaned closer. Daniel said, once the paperwork settles, he's boxed in. Liam laughed quietly. My chest tightened. I stepped inside and forced a smile. Am I interrupting? Daniel turned fast and said, just talking projections, I joked. Sounded serious. He smiled smoothly and said, you know me, always serious. I laughed, but it felt wrong. I said, everything on track? Daniel nodded. Perfect. Liam added, clean and simple. I walked away, telling myself I imagined it. Still, my hands felt cold. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I said to myself, you're overthinking. Another voice said, you heard what you heard. I opened my laptop. I told myself, just a quick look. I searched old emails. Daniel's replies were short now. Liam's approvals came too fast. I whispered, that's normal. Then I noticed dates, changed numbers, revised language. I said, no, my stomach turned. I opened contracts I hadn't reviewed closely. Clauses shifted. Responsibility moved. Liability pointed at me. I rubbed my face and said, they wouldn't. My phone buzzed. Daniel texted, big week ahead. I typed back, all good. He replied, always. That word felt heavy. I remembered moments I ignored, Olivia's silence, Sophie's warning, Liam's confidence, Daniel's control. I said, you trusted them. Another voice answered, they used that. I closed the laptop, then opened it again. I didn't want truth, but it waited patiently. At midnight, I called Sophie. I asked, have you noticed anything strange? She paused and said, I didn't want to be wrong. I said, about what? She whispered, about them. My heart sank. I said, why didn't you tell me? She replied, you wouldn't have believed me. She was right. I ended the call and sat in the dark. I said, I built this place. The thought twisted. I realized something ugly. Protection looks like weakness to the wrong people. The next morning, Daniel walked in and said, you look tired. I said, didn't sleep. He smiled. Stress comes with leadership. I asked lightly, you ever worry about trust? He didn't hesitate. Never. That answer scared me more than doubt. I watched him leave and said to myself, they're planning something. My chest hurt saying it. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. I looked at the signed documents again and whispered, I gave them the tools. Trust cracked, slow and painful. Betrayal didn't scream. It whispered patiently, while smiling at me every day, waiting for the moment I finally understood what it was becoming. I walked into the boardroom and said, why is everyone here? Daniel didn't smile. He said, we need to talk. That tone told me everything. I sat down and said, all right, talk. Liam connected his laptop and said, this won't take long. Daniel looked around and said, we have concerns about leadership. I laughed once and said, concerns? He replied, serious ones. Liam clicked the screen and said, these numbers show misuse of funds. My throat tightened. I said, that's a lie. Liam said calmly, the reports are clear. I leaned forward and said, those reports came from your department. Daniel cut in. Which makes this harder? I asked. Harder for who? He said, for all of us. I looked at Olivia and said, you know this isn't true. She stared at the table. Silence filled the room. I said louder, Olivia. She whispered, I don't know. That hurt more than the accusation. I said, "You're accusing me of stealing from my own company?" Daniel replied, "We're saying you made decisions that harmed it." I said, "With your approval." Liam said, "Approval based on incomplete information." My hand shook. I stood and said, "This is insane." Daniel stayed seated and said, "Sit down." That command burned. I said, "You don't get to tell me that." He replied, "This board does." A member I trusted said, "Ethan, explain the expenses." I said, "They were operational." Liam said, "They were personal." I said, "Prove it." He said, "We did." Daniel leaned forward and said, "You signed everything." My chest felt hollow. I said, "Because I trusted you." He answered, "That's not our issue." The room blurred. I said, "You planned this." Daniel said, "We prepared." Liam added, "For stability." I laughed bitterly and said, "You're replacing me." Daniel didn't deny it. I said, "After everything I gave you?" He said, "This isn't personal." That was the lie that broke me. I looked around and said, "You're letting this happen?" No one answered. The chairperson said, "We'll vote." My heart pounded. I said, "You know me." Someone said, "We know the documents." Hands raised, one by one, against me. I felt small. I said, "This company is my life." Daniel said, "It will survive." I whispered, "Without me." He nodded. The decision passed. Removal effective immediately. My ears rang. I stood slowly. I said, "You'll regret this." Daniel said, "We're at peace with it." I walked to the door. My legs felt weak. I turned back and said, "I trusted you." Daniel replied, "You shouldn't have." I stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind me. The sound echoed. Something inside me cracked, clean and final. I realized I didn't just lose my company, I lost my faith in people. I walked away knowing they didn't just push me out. They declared war, and they thought I wouldn't survive it. I sat on the floor and said, "It's over." The room didn't answer. I laughed once and said, "You really did it." My phone lay face down. I didn't want it to ring. I didn't want voices. I wanted silence, but my head wouldn't shut up. I said out loud, "How did I miss it?" My voice sounded weak. I replayed Daniel's smile. Liam's calm tone. Olivia's silence. I pressed my palms to my face and said, "I built everything, and I lost it in one room." Anger hit first. I said, "They used me." I stood and kicked a chair. Shame followed fast. I whispered, "I let them." That hurt worse. Grief came last, heavy and quiet. I sat back down and said, "This was my life." I picked up my phone and stared at my sister's name. I hesitated, then called. Rachel answered and said, "Ethan?" I said, "I messed up." My voice broke. She said, "Slow down." I said, "They took the company." She paused and said, "Are you safe?" I laughed bitterly and said, "Define safe." She said, "Are you breathing?" I said, "Barely." She said, "Then you're not done." I said, "I failed." She replied, "You trusted." I snapped, "That's the same thing." She said, "No, it isn't." I leaned against the wall and said, "I don't know who I am without it." She said, "You were someone before it." I said, "I don't remember him." She answered, "I do." Silence sat between us. I asked, "Should I fight them?" She said, "Do you want revenge or peace?" I didn't answer. She added, "Be honest." I whispered, "I wanted to stop hurting." She said, "Then don't decide tonight." After the call, I stared at the ceiling and said, "Maybe I should walk away." The thought scared me. Another thought followed. Maybe that's what they expect. I clenched my fists and said, "I won't let them define the ending." I remembered Daniel saying it wasn't personal. I said, "Liar." I remembered my own words about loyalty. I said, "Idiot." I hated myself for that. Then I stopped and said, "Enough." I stood and looked around the apartment. Boxes I never unpacked. Awards I never hung. I said, I gave everything to one place. That realization hurt, but it also cleared something. I wasn't empty. I was misplaced. I sat again and whispered, "What now?" No answer came, but the noise in my head softened. I realized something small but solid. I was still here. They didn't erase me. They exposed me. I said, "I don't know the next move." That felt honest. I breathed slowly and said, "But I won't disappear." The pain didn't fade. It stayed sharp and real. But beneath it, something steadier formed. I wasn't ready for revenge. I wasn't ready to forgive. I was ready to see clearly. For the first time since the boardroom, I wasn't drowning. I was floating, bruised, angry, and alive, staring at the ruins and realizing they weren't the end. I sat across from Marcus Halle and said, I didn't come for sympathy. He nodded once and said, Good. His office was quiet. That helped. I said, They removed me. He replied, Tell me how. I talked. I didn't stop. I said, Daniel let it. I said, Liam backed him. I said, They framed me. Marcus didn't interrupt. He wrote nothing. He just listened. That scared me more than anger. When I finished, I said, Say something. Marcus asked, Do you want revenge? I paused. I said, I want control. He nodded and said, That's better. He asked, Did you sign the Emergency Governance Amendment 3 years ago? I frowned and said, The investor safety one? He said, Yes. I laughed bitterly and said, That thing was useless. He looked at me and said, No, it wasn't. He slid a folder toward me. He said, Clause 12. I read it and said, This is boilerplate. He replied, It's a trigger. I looked up and said, For what? He said, For misconduct by executives. I felt my chest tighten. I said, They accused me. He said, And documented it. I said, That hurts me. He said calmly, Only if it's true. I leaned forward and said, They falsified reports. Marcus said, Then they exposed themselves. I shook my head and said, I don't see it. He tapped the page and said, You gave yourself audit authority. I laughed quietly and said, I forgot about that. He replied, They did too. That word landed hard. I said, What does it mean? He said, It means they rushed. I asked, Can I fight this? He said, You already are. I said, I feel powerless. He looked at me and said, You feel emotional. That stung. I said, Same thing. He replied, No. He continued, Anger makes noise. Precision makes results. I asked, So what do we do? He said, Nothing yet. I frowned and said, That's it? He said, We wait. I shook my head. They're celebrating, Marcus said. Good. I asked, Why? He said, Arrogance leaves fingerprints. I exhaled slowly and said, You're calm. He answered, Because this is clean. I asked, You're sure? He said, If you didn't lie to me. I said, I didn't. He nodded. He stood and said, They think they won. I said, They did. He turned and said, Temporarily. Hope felt dangerous. I said, I don't want to burn everything down. Marcus said, You won't. I asked, Then what? He replied, You'll let the law speak. I thought about Daniel's face. I said, He trusted my silence. Marcus said, That's his mistake. As I stood to leave, I said, I kept you on retainer as insurance. Marcus said, You paid for leverage. I walked out and said to myself, I don't need revenge. That felt true. I added, I need accuracy. For the first time since the boardroom, my hands stopped shaking. Control didn't rush back. It crept, quiet, steady, real. I stayed quiet. That was the hardest part. My phone buzzed, and I didn't answer. Emails came in, and I ignored them. I told myself silence is part of the plan. Saying it didn't make it easier. Daniel called me first. I let it ring. He texted, Hope you're doing okay. I laughed and said out loud, You don't care. I didn't reply. An hour later, Liam posted a photo online. Champagne glasses. Smiles, I said. Already celebrating. Noah Brooks met me for coffee. He looked nervous and said, I shouldn't be here, I said. Then talk fast. He whispered, They're fighting. I asked, About what? He said, Power. That made sense. Noah said, Daniel took your office. I nodded. He added, He changed policies. I asked, How's morale? Noah laughed softly and said, Bad. I said, Why? He said, Because they don't trust each other. I leaned back and said, Anything else? Noah hesitated. Olivia keeps asking about you. I raised an eyebrow. What does she say? He replied, She says it feels wrong. I said, It is. Later that day, Olivia called me. I answered after the third ring. She said, I just wanted to check on you. I replied, You already did. Silence followed. She said, Things are messy here. I said, I'm sure. She whispered, I didn't mean for this. I said, But you let it happen. She said, I was scared. I answered, So was I. She didn't respond. I ended the call first. Daniel left me a voicemail. We're stabilizing the company. I said to the empty room, you're feeding it poison. Another message followed. We wish you the best. I said, liar. I met Marcus later. He asked, any contact? I said, too much. He replied, good. I frowned. Why? He said, confidence makes people careless. I nodded. The next week, Daniel posted again. Promotion announcement. Big words, bigger smiles. I watched and said, enjoy it. Noah texted me, finance and ops aren't aligned. I replied, they never were. I ran into Liam at a restaurant. He said, didn't expect to see you. I smiled and said, life goes on. He laughed and said, looks like we won. I said, looks like. He raised his glass, no hard feelings. I didn't toast back. He leaned in and said, you should have fought. I answered, I am. He laughed, too late. I paid my bill and said, timing matters. He didn't understand. That night, I sat alone and reviewed notes, dates, emails, behavior. I said, they're sloppy. I felt calm saying it. Not angry. Focused. Daniel texted, hope you found peace. I typed, working on it, and deleted the message. Silence was louder. I realized something simple. Power doesn't need to shout. It waits, it watches, it lets others expose themselves. I wasn't gone. I was positioned. As I turned off the light, I said, let them celebrate. My voice was steady. Every party ends. Marcus called me and said, it's time. I asked, are you sure? He replied, they made it easy. I said, do it. He didn't hesitate. Already done. By noon, Daniel's number flashed on my phone. I didn't answer. Liam emailed, we need to talk. I closed it. Marcus texted, accounts frozen. My chest tightened, not with fear, but relief. Marcus said, auditors are in the building. I asked, all departments? He said, everyone they touched. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The meeting invitation came fast. Emergency board session. I said, I'll attend. Marcus replied, saying nothing until the end. I said, I won't. I walked into the room and said, good afternoon. No one answered. Daniel looked pale. Liam avoided my eyes. I sat down and folded my hands. Daniel cleared his throat and said, this meeting is about interference. I tilted my head. Interference? Liam spoke fast. Unauthorized audits. I said calmly, authorized. Daniel snapped. You have no authority here. I waited. He continued, this is harassment. I said nothing. Marcus nodded slightly from the corner. Liam pulled up documents and said, these actions hurt the company. I asked, which company? Silence followed. Daniel leaned forward and said, you're desperate. I smiled faintly. You're nervous. His jaw tightened. The chairperson said, Mr. Walker, explain yourself. I finally spoke. Clause 12. The room shifted. Daniel said, that's irrelevant. Marcus said, it isn't. I said, you accused me of misconduct. Liam said, with proof. I replied, you created that proof. Olivia looked up sharply. Marcus stood and said, trigger activated. He slid papers across the table. Mandatory audits, asset review, temporary control suspension. Daniel stood and said, this is illegal. Marcus replied, it's contractual. Daniel pointed at me and said, you planned this. I said, you rushed this. Liam whispered, fix this. Daniel snapped, shut up. That was new. I watched panic move through the room. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew. I stayed quiet. Daniel turned to me and said, you'll regret this. I met his eyes and said, I already did. He lowered his voice and said, we can make a deal. I shook my head. You already did. Olivia spoke for the first time. What happens now? Marcus answered, truth. The chairperson said, this meeting is suspended. I stood slowly. I said, I'll wait. As I walked out, Daniel followed. He hissed, you think you won? I stopped and said, no. He smirked. Then what? I replied, I know. Behind me, phones rang, voices cracked. The building felt different. Not mine, not theirs. Just honest. Outside, Marcus said, they're finished. I said, they did it to themselves. My phone buzzed again. Daniel texted, call me. I deleted it. I didn't feel joy. I felt balance. Karma didn't scream, it followed rules. It waited for arrogance to sign its name. I looked up and said quietly, I'm done reacting. For the first time, the power shift was complete. I didn't take anything back by force. I let the truth walk in and locked the doors behind it. Daniel's voice was low when he called, Ethan, please. Let's talk. I didn't answer. He texted, I can fix this. I typed back, you broke it. Silence followed. He showed up at my office the next morning. I said, you're early. He said, I need to explain. I leaned back and said, go ahead. Daniel's hands shook. I didn't mean, I interrupted. You meant exactly that. He swallowed hard and said, please, we can negotiate. I shook my head. Negotiation isn't part of the plan. Liam appeared next, looking frustrated. This wasn't supposed to happen. I said, didn't you sign the papers? He shrugged and said, I followed orders. I asked, orders from whom? He said, everyone else. I nodded slowly. Accountability is yours alone, Liam. Olivia called me last. She said quietly, Ethan, I'm sorry. I didn't speak. She added, I should have spoken up. I said nothing. Her voice cracked. I didn't know how. I replied, you do now. Over the next days, the ripple hit them. Daniel's reputation slipped fast. Clients left. Colleagues whispered. I read emails Liam didn't see coming. He blamed vendors, then investors, then himself. Each excuse fell apart. I watched Olivia's confidence crumble. She avoided everyone, even those who had once admired her. I didn't feel satisfaction. I just observed. Daniel begged again, in writing this time. Ethan, for old time's sake, I deleted the email. Liam sent a text. This isn't fair, I replied internally. You built this. Calls came from clients. I stayed quiet. Media mentions surfaced. I didn't react. Every fall was precise, legal, and deserved. Justice moved slowly, but unstoppable. I remembered nights of rage. I remembered tears and hopelessness. None of that mattered anymore. Watching their masks fall gave me more than revenge ever could. Daniel finally cornered me in the lobby. He whispered, you don't feel anything? I said, I feel clarity. His eyes widened. Clarity? I nodded. Yes, I wanted fairness, not ruin. You delivered it yourself. Liam muttered behind him, it's not real. It can't be real. I said, reality has rules. Olivia approached quietly, eyes downcast. I said, you know why? She whispered, I do. I didn't answer. I just walked past, feeling light for the first time in months. Clients, colleagues, and whispers shifted around them like wind. I watched without interfering. They dismantled themselves with every misstep, every lie, every miscalculation. I understood now. Revenge would have been chaos. Justice was exact. Justice was final. By the end of the week, Daniel, Liam, and Olivia were shadows of their former selves. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just observed. I sat in my office alone and whispered, this is what balance feels like. I closed the folder with their names on it. The weight lifted. I realized something deeper. Power isn't about taking, it's about letting truth unfold. I didn't need to act. They did it themselves. For the first time, I felt untangled from anger. I felt light, detached, steady. Justice had spoken. I listened. I sat in the corner office, alone, and whispered, it's mine again. The chair felt different. The view felt different. I had control, but it didn't thrill me. I said, why isn't this enough? Sophie appeared quietly at the doorway. Ethan. I said, Sophie. She stepped in slowly and said, I saw what happened. I nodded. You didn't have to return. She said, I wanted to. She looked around, eyes cautious. You look different. I laughed softly. Different isn't always good. She smiled faintly. You're calmer, I said. Calmer, yes. But not lighter. She sat across from me. Does it feel good? I said. Winning? She nodded. I shook my head. No, not really. It feels hollow. Sophie frowned. Hollow? I said. I thought I'd feel power. I thought I'd feel revenge. She whispered. And? I said. Nothing. I watched them destroy themselves. I didn't touch a finger. I should feel joy. I don't. She leaned forward. You changed, I said. I had to. They taught me what trust costs, she said. You still trust anyone? I paused. Not easily. Sophie nodded. So what now? I said, I lead differently. I measure more. I observe more. I speak less, she said. And power? I shook my head. Power isn't excitement anymore. It's responsibility. Nothing more. We sat in silence. I thought about Daniel, Liam, Olivia. Their arrogance, their betrayal, their downfall. I whispered, I survived because I adapted. Sophie said quietly, and you did it without losing yourself. I looked at her. Did I? She smiled faintly. You've changed. That's natural. I leaned back and whispered, I thought winning would heal the rage. I thought it would close the holes. But it doesn't. Acceptance does. Sophie asked. Acceptance? I said, accepting what happened. Accepting what I did. Accepting the cost. She nodded slowly. And that feels better? I said. Strangely, yes. Peace feels like quiet, not triumph. I thought about the nights I spent pacing, calling Rachel, talking to Marcus. I whispered, the cost was high. Too high to forget. Sophie said, then remember carefully. I said, I will. She stood. I'll leave you to it. I nodded. Thank you for coming back. She smiled. Always. After she left, I looked at the city lights and whispered, I survived betrayal, ruin, and arrogance. I rebuilt from silence and patience. I touched the desk. The cost of winning isn't happiness, it's clarity. I sat back and said, I won, but the real victory is knowing I can survive myself. The room was quiet. I didn't need applause. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to accept. For the first time, I felt steady, not powerful, not triumphant, just myself, and that was enough. The envelope sat on my desk, white, simple, no flourish. I picked it up and whispered, Daniel. I didn't expect words, only reminders. I slid the letter open. Ethan, it began. His handwriting was precise. I read silently. He admitted it all. Every scheme, every manipulation, every lie, no excuses, no blame shifting, just truth. I leaned back and said, finally, my chest didn't tighten. My hands didn't shake. I read each line, letting it sink without judgment. He wrote, I miscalculated. You were right. I betrayed trust I could never repay. I whispered, that's obvious. He continued, I hope you find peace, even if I cannot ask for forgiveness. I closed my eyes and said, I don't need it. I set the letter aside. No response. Silence felt heavier than any words I could offer. I touched the desk where my old office key rested, rusted slightly. I whispered, this was my domain once. The key reminded me of nights spent building, trusting, hoping. A photo leaned against the frame. Daniel, Liam, and me years ago. Smiles unguarded. I touched the glass and said, we were different then. No one was smiling now, but the memory lingered. I thought about Sophie, Rachel, Marcus. They had shaped the outcome I held in my hands. I whispered, I needed them more than him. The lesson was clear. Power and revenge were temporary. Truth and patience endured. I read the letter again. You have my sincerest regrets. I smiled faintly, not at him, at me. I whispered, I survived your betrayal. That's enough. The envelope went into the drawer, beside folders of contracts and documents that once dictated my life. I closed it slowly. Each click of the lock sounded final. I stood and walked to the window. The city stretched below, indifferent, alive. I said, I let go. The weight on my shoulders lifted slightly, not fully, but enough to breathe. I touched the office key one last time. No more reminders? I whispered. The photo remained, smiling at a time that no longer existed. I didn't need to take it down. Its lesson was already learned. I leaned against the glass and said, silence is enough. The apology, the confession, even the betrayal, none required action. Closure didn't need forgiveness. It needed understanding, and I had it. Daniel's words no longer had power over me. I didn't feel victory or revenge. I felt clarity. I whispered to the empty office, I am free. The word echoed softly. I could move on. I could trust cautiously again. I could lead without fear. The sun shifted on the skyline, warm light spilling across the desk. I took a deep breath and said, it's over. I left the office, key in hand, letter locked away. Behind me, the past remained, but it no longer held me. I had survived, learned, and finally let go. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need forgiveness. I only needed peace, and I had it. I unlocked the door to my new office and whispered, "Here we go again." The room was smaller. Fewer windows, fewer distractions. I liked it that way. Quiet suited me. Sophie stopped by with coffee. "Ethan, this is cozy," I smiled faintly. "Cozy is better than empty." She laughed softly. "You've changed," I said. "I hope so." She asked, "Are you nervous?" I shook my head. "Not anymore. I trust less, but I see clearer." She raised an eyebrow. "Care to explain?" I said. "Experience teaches quickly. People show themselves. No need to guess." She nodded. "And Daniel, Liam, Olivia?" I smiled faintly. "They're gone, not by my hand. By their choices. Integrity exposed them." Sophie looked impressed. "That must feel satisfying," I said. "Not exactly. Relief is closure, maybe. Power isn't fun anymore." I sat at my desk and looked over the files. "This company may be smaller, but it's mine to lead differently." Sophie said, "Lead differently?" I replied, "Smarter, measured, careful." She asked, "Alone?" I nodded. "For now, I need clarity. I need to rebuild my instincts." She smiled faintly. "I'll help where I can." I said, "Good. I need allies who understand boundaries." Later, I called Marcus. "All set?" he asked. I said, "Yes. Legal secured. Everything documented." He said, "You've grown, Ethan." I said quietly, "Betrayal didn't end me. It rebuilt me." I walked around the office, touching walls, imagining the potential. I whispered, "I lost a lot, but I gained perspective." Sophie said, "Perspective is power too." I nodded. Noah Brooks stopped by. "Heard you're back in business." I said, "Smaller scale. Less drama." He laughed. "That's wise." I said, "It's necessary. Control without chaos is better than chaos without control." I looked at the city below. The skyline was different from before, but my view hadn't changed. I whispered, "I've learned to see clearly, to anticipate, to protect myself without fear." Sophie asked softly, "Are you happy?" I paused. Happiness is quiet now. Stability feels better. I don't crave triumph over others. I crave balance. I smiled faintly and said, "The past shaped me, but it doesn't define me." Sophie nodded. "Then you're ready." I said, "Yes. Ready to lead, ready to trust cautiously, ready to grow." I walked to the window, breathed deeply, and said, "I didn't destroy them. They revealed themselves." My integrity was the test, and I passed, Sophie said. "So, what now?" I replied, "Forward. Alone, but stronger. Wiser, calmer, clearer." The office was quiet. The world outside buzzed. I felt grounded. I whispered, "Betrayal rebuilt me. Not revenge, not anger, integrity." I sat at my desk and touched the first contract. "I start small, but I start right." Sophie smiled. "You'll thrive," I said. "I will." I looked around once more and whispered, "I walk forward alone, but stronger. Nothing else matters." For the first time in years, I felt complete, not powerful, not vengeful, just steady, clear, and alive.